So first of all, apologies for the delay. Good things are worth waiting for, right? So good evening, everyone, and welcome to this panel discussion whose main topic is Christianity in post-Christian world. Even though this friendly debate of the century is clearly impossible to finish with satisfaction within the given time frame, I'm convinced that a miracle is something that all of our panelists strongly believe in. What is the goal of this discussion? Not to provide clear black and white answers, but to make some very important questions more intelligible, more real, so to speak. Let me reintroduce our panelists quite shortly. Dariusz Karlowicz is a Polish philosopher and lecturer at the Warsaw University who helped to found the Center for the Thought of John Paul II. He is also the editor-in-chief of the Polish journal Political Theology, which examines the questions at the crossroads of philosophy, religion, and politics, and it is worth mentioning that his intellectual life is well balanced with his rich experience in the world of business. John Finnis is an Australian legal philosopher who spent his academic career mostly at Oxford University and Notre Dame University in Indiana. Without any doubt, he is certainly the most influential conservative legal theoretician whose books on the modern return to Thomistic tradition of natural law have become classics in the field. And lastly, Rod Dreher. Rod is a well-known American journalist, and as you all surely know, the author of the bestseller Benedict Option, and also the author of How Dante Changed My Life, Saved My Life, which maps his conversion to Catholicism. Over the pond, he is known for his criticism and critic approach to the Catholic Church, and the reporting on the sexual abuse scandals led him to his conversion from Catholicism to Eastern Orthodoxy. So let me give you a quick heads-on on the structure of this discussion. So the first half, 45 minutes approximately, will reflect on the main topic and we'll split it in three different perspectives, different themes. First, we'll look at the Christianity in the post-Christian world through the topic of religion. Secondly, through the topic of culture. And lastly, politics. In the second half, it's the time for your questions, either through the Slido or just raise your hand, and please do wait for your mic. So let's start. Christianity in the post-Christian world. Before jumping into the three different themes, I was thinking, well, it's quite a complex concept, isn't it? The post-Christian world. So I'd like to ask our panelists just succinctly give us what they understand by the post-Christian world. The term seems quite ambiguous, right? So please, could you give us a short summary of what you consider the post-Christian world to be?
Well, I'll start, and by the way, they had me here tonight because they couldn't get Slavoj Žižek, so I hope I don't disappoint. My idea of the post-Christian world is not a world where there are no Christians. Clearly, there still are many Christians, thank God. But rather, it's the fact that we live in a world where Christianity is no longer at the center of our civilization and the way we understand ourselves. Therefore, Christians within this civilization are going to have to be creative minorities, to use the term of Benedict XVI.
I think the term post-Christian began as a propaganda term of secularists and anti-Christians. The absorption by Christians of the secularist critique has led to the so-called post-Christian world in the sense that Rodrea just defined it, namely of populations in which Christian ideas are no longer dominant in the law or in the institutions, in the education of children and so forth. So that's a fact. And so where a population might once have been 80 or 90 or 95% Christian in some sense, signed up to these laws inspired by Christianity and going to Christian schools and so forth. Now the same population, or rather the population in the same territory, may only be 10% Christian. So what began as a propaganda term is now just a sober statement of fact.
Thank you. Dariusz?
Yeah, I do agree that it's not an empty term. The answer shortly might be connected with the answer what burned in the heart of Paris. Was it the House of God or a monument? Are we living in the Europe of monuments, or we are living in, as old famous book taught us, in the Europe of cathedrals? More and more, the answer about monuments is present in a European mind. The problem with that question is that using many different analogies of nowadays situation of Christianity, Ron, for example, refers to the 6th century after Christ. Many people do it with early Christianity. I'm very, say, linked to that perspective. But frankly speaking, the differentia specifica, I mean, that what differs us from many other situations mostly, is that we are living surrounded by a Christian heritage to which we have very unclear law to that heritage. I mean, and that Christians differ in the attitude towards that heritage. Some of them says it's perfectly Catholic culture sing. Let's help them sing faster. We'll come back to the pure Christianity. The other says that's the important expression of incarnation of word in a culture, and we have to save each element of that because it's worth to fight for that. Of course, that's a caricature, that's too radical position, but that's how look like, that's my feeling, the answer on the question expressed in the name of our panel. What to do with that, what we have? Is it alive, and to which extent is important still to our Christian life?
Let's just stay with this clarifying phase. So it could be said that the post-Christian world is sometimes identified with post-modern world. Some people would make that link. But there used to be a pre-Christian world. Now we're thinking of the post-Christian world. So perhaps by the post-Christian, we could just be coming back to the pre-Christian, and somehow from the post-modern, we could be coming to the pre-modern. What did you say about this?
Well, I don't think that it's possible to unlearn Christianity. I mean, the Western world has gone through Christianization and thrown it off. The early centuries of Christianity, that was a time when Christianity was spreading to the pagan world. Christianity was something new. It's no longer that. I think that, I believe Charles Taylor might be the one who said that this is actually a possibility for good things to happen for Christianity because Christianity can seem radical once again. I think that is an optimistic view. It's a view that I hope is true, and I operate as if it's true. But we have to contend with a world that once had a sacred story, and it was the story of told in the Bible, in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And now, if we have a sacred story, it is the story of the Enlightenment, of the throwing off of the shackles of religion and tradition, and the embracing of the unfettered, autonomous self. I think that is what Philip Reeve called an anti-culture, but that is what we have now.
Professor Finnis?
Well, I'm very reluctant to adopt any of these periodizations. And when one starts talking about pre-modern and post-modern, I mean, post-modern is an almost openly absurd term for perhaps a cluster of almost openly or actually openly absurd positions which can't defend themselves, which refute themselves,
such
which
as?
openly abdicate from the search for truth, and therefore disqualify themselves from serious consideration. So this is not a set of opinions that can survive for very long, except as parasitic on something else, some other political movements and so on. But I reject the attempt to periodize in terms of this is an era, this is a post-Christian era, etc. I accept as a reporting a certain set of facts about a given population. As I said, that might be a sober fact. But when I think that from 1570 through to, I don't know, 1800, in England, let's take the Catholic minority, whose religion was strictly prohibited, who found themselves in the 1570s, 1580s, treated as a tiny minority, and who, as it were, relived the experience of Thomas More when he was called upon to take the oath, and he refused to take the oath, and the Privy Council said to him, well, you sit here and think about it, because if you don't take the oath, you're a traitor, and your family will be disinherited, and you may be executed in the most gruesome way. So he sat there and thought about it, and looking out of the window, he saw all the clergy of London pass by and take the oath, except for 2 or 3 priests who were taken straight away to the Tower. And in due course, he saw all the bishops of England, except one bishop, surrender to a state church, which was radically anti-Catholic, not immediately then, but within a few years. So for hundreds of years, you have a population which, of course, doesn't say and couldn't say that the state church was not Christian, but was treated by the state church as representing Antichrist. And so it's not Christian post-Christian, but there's a radical status of minority which is at least as radical as the status of Christians in any population now. And I think we need to, I don't think we should treat the modern situation as wholly exceptional. Of course, there are major differences between the Enlightenment and Calvinist state theology in England. But there are also major similarities in the social situation of a population of believing Christians.
Dariusz?
Well, from the Christian point of view, we are living in the era of Jesus Christ and waiting for times of Holy Spirit. That's our perspective. Post-Christian belong to the different sphere of category. But what's interesting is that I think when I'm talking about a discussion on the Christian culture heritage, I think we are faced with an important discussion on that what belongs to the question of a goal. Because we focus usually on the nowadays situation and that what happened. The open question, which I'm always interested in that kind of discussion, is what do we want to achieve? What do we want to achieve? What kind of a future? We imagine as a situation which will be say, will be happy in that? I mean, what kind of, if any? Why I say about two models of kind of attitude towards Christian heritage. Charles Taylor, you've mentioned, he find collapse of Christianity as a political and cultural model as a chance, as a positive phenomenon. I remember his speech in Krakow. He says, well, that's a big chance for us. What a kind of a chance is it? That's a question for me. I mean, what means presence of Christianity in the political, cultural reality? What means an effect of evangelization? How does it affect, and do we really think? How can it affect economy, for example? I mean, can we imagine a second phase of a Christian culture in nowadays reality? Will it destroy global economy or not? How will it look like politics if we'll be not thinking only on defensive way, but to think, I mean, when someone would come here and says, okay, I see two famous intellectuals reading a lot on Christianity. How can you describe future, gentlemen? That's interesting. I mean, if everything will go on the way you treat it, you find it as a proper one.
Let us ask one of the intellectuals, so please.
Well, I think those big questions about what should we do, who is the we, nobody is in charge of the culture. The issue for any given Christian is, can he or she transmit the faith to his or her children? That's the central question. That's a real question which a real person can actually do something about. I can't do anything about the culture. I can talk to my students in Oxford. I can write books which people may or may not read. I don't know about that. But there's no way in which I or Charles Taylor or any of us can, as it were, decide to shape the culture in some way. But we can decide how to transmit the faith and what to transmit the faith as to our immediate surroundings. And the people we're responsible for are our children. If we're teaching students in a university, they didn't come to hear our message of Christianity, so it would be improper to start talking about the grounds of the Christian faith in the class on legal theory in Oxford, and I don't think one should. But if I fail to transmit the faith to my children and their children, then I've got something to answer for. That was a responsibility I failed in. So I don't think we have a responsibility for the culture as a whole, or for the society, the economy as a whole. I don't think these questions are very real.
Could you elaborate on this? Like, what do you mean by not being able to influence or change the culture? Because I think one of the assumptions in asking, well, what should and could the Christians do? There's the assumptions that perhaps we should do something with the culture. And then you have different definitions of what culture is, right? You have T.S. Eliot, it's a side effect of something else. You can never touch the culture, because by touching it, you are unculturing it. So what do you mean by not being able to influence the culture? Because I think many people disagree with you.
What do you mean by influencing the culture? How does one influence a culture? You teach what you can teach, you research what you can research, you tell the stories that you can tell about what you've discovered, and that's your contribution to the culture, but you don't stand over the culture managing it. And I think these, as I say, are unreal questions.
Well, no, I think I'm somewhere between the two of you. I'm more sympathetic with you, Professor Finnis, because I believe that one of the reasons Christians in the United States, conservative Christians, have gotten themselves into such trouble is we have thought about saving the culture and about waging the culture war, which is a real war. But we have thought that if we only get the right judges in place and keep voting for Republicans and dominate the political field, everything will sort itself out. And that hasn't happened at all. I find such inspiration in St. Benedict of Nursia, because when he left the city of Rome in the late 5th century, turn of the 6th century, he didn't set out to make Rome great again. He didn't set out to think of ways that he could restore what was lost. His question was, quaerere Deum? Where may I find God? How can I find God? And all he wanted to do was establish small communities of faith within which men could find, and then later with the Benedictine nuns, where they could find God in a specific way. I think that is what the best we can hope to do right now. Whenever I travel around the U.S. to give speeches at colleges, Catholic colleges or evangelical colleges about the Benedict option, I always ask professors, what are you seeing among the students? Without fail, no matter what college, they say the greatest thing is that young people come to us knowing nothing about the faith. Nothing. Even if they come out of Catholic or Protestant schools, they know the faith is at best an emotional disposition. They try to do their best to educate them in the faith, but the formation and the knowledge, most of it that should have been done in childhood, isn't there. And I fear that we parents, we priests, we teachers who should take on the responsibility of forming the next generation, we have failed at that. It's very hard to blame the younger generation when they have been given nothing by us. So what I hope to do is to form these small communities and encourage the formation of small communities where the faith can be passed down, and then we'll see what happens. But in the U.S. right now, it's all we can do to protect religious liberty, to protect the ability to form these communities within local institutions, such as churches, religious schools, and so forth. To me, if we can just protect that space, that public space for formation, we will have achieved a great deal.
So, for the sake of structure, if there's any, this is opening up the perspective of the culture, right? Like Christianity in the post-Christian world from the point of view of culture. And I have one question to lead into this perspective perhaps more clearly. And again, it reflects how we, and now it's going to be difficult to actually explain, how do we live in a culture if we can't change it? So that's become the assumption now. So what do we as Christians do in the post-Christian culture? And the usual dichotomy is, well, something from within or something from without. So my question is, what do you think about this approach? Do you side with one, so perhaps forming the intentional creative minorities, so that would be from without, as far as I understand it? Or should we be part of the overall institutional structure and strive for something from within? Or do you refuse this dichotomy altogether?
Well, you do what you can, and what you can do, it depends on opportunities available because of your abilities or lack of abilities or limited abilities and your speciality and so on. You can't decide to become the person who saves the culture, but you can decide to be a good philosopher or a good lawyer or a good teacher of legal theory or a good physicist or a good doctor or a good nurse and so forth. And you can decide to be a good parent who takes his or her responsibilities very seriously, especially in relation to communicating the faith and handing on. We rather skipped the first, I think, third of the subject, which I thought was going to be religion in the...
We're coming back to it.
But you've skipped on to culture, but we've left out religion. So it's as what I said at the outset, the penetration of the religion, the seduction of the religion by the anti-religion, by the secularist denials, which is the cause of our problem and the failure of the church, its parish priests, its bishops, and its parents to communicate the faith to the next generation. That's a very simple and intelligible thing. And unless that is understood and then responded to, all the talk about saving the culture is simply hands in the air, empty.
Well, I don't believe in that assumption. The culture, it's one of human beings' opera. That's one of a thing we participate and we change it. And there is no doubt that it was different 20, 50, and 10 years ago than it's now. And it's nothing, I mean, in your perspective, there are some mysterious powers who change it. We can only do our best and that's it. No, I mean, we are, of course, that was my first glance, first feeling. The second is probably that our experience is shaped in the different realities. We are living in a relatively stable world where, I mean, influence of a citizen on the reality is limited. I'm living in the reality in which me and my friends, we created a law, habits, art, institutions, etc. 6 years ago, I came to the idea to make a meeting of Christians during Three Kings signed. It's a kind of big meeting with a theater, and now it's almost in 1,000 towns and villages in Poland after 6 years. I mean, reality in Poland, in Slovakia is plastic. I mean, we feel ability of changing it. The problem is that even in the reality you refer to, Professor, even finding a maximal possibility on doing properly that what you do, and even having comfort not to have students, what we don't have in Slovakia, in Poland, students who ask, how should look like reality? Coming ministers who ask, how can we and should we create a law to have a proper proportion between religion and the state, for example? I mean, we took part in that kind of decisions. Even if you have that comfort that you don't have to risk the answer, people who are coming on your lectures, and I know some of them, one of them is probably now the best minister of economy in Poland, Jadwiga Emilewicz, who joined your seminar during a year. They want to know from you why, what's a goal of that, even social, because I mean, no one can say your action on university will have no consequence, referring to the famous Weaver book. I mean, even acting properly as a professor of, I don't know, St. Thomas Aquinas, you influence reality. And you are responsible for that reaction to certain level, of course. So you should have an idea what's expected influence on the reality, even in that very limited sense.
Well, the question I have, Professor Finnis, is what happens in a situation, a social situation, a cultural situation, where in order to gain access to the world of law, to become a good lawyer, or to become a good doctor, one has to compromise more than a Christian can compromise. To be concrete, I talked to a very prominent Catholic physician in the United States who told me that he would not want his children to go into medicine because he can see what's coming in the law, where the laws will be passed to force them to be willing to perform abortions or do other procedures that would absolutely violate their conscience. Today, I did had one of the most remarkable days of my life. I mean that literally. I spent this morning in a secret room where Christian Samizdat was printed under communism, and this afternoon I visited the apartment of Bishop Koretz. I heard this amazing story about this man, Koretz, who was ordained a secret bishop in the underground church, went to prison. When he came out, he was forced to be a manual laborer. And yet, he could not, because of the restrictions under communism, he couldn't be an open bishop. But those restrictions compelled him to be an incredibly effective leader. I've heard stories in these past 2 days in Bratislava about what the suffering of the underground church, how that saved Slovakia. And this man, Bishop Koretz, who could not gain access to the world of the influential, nevertheless, in his little apartment and the things he did, had a tremendous effect on the culture. So I guess my question is simply, what happens when you can't be a good lawyer because you're a Catholic, you can't be a good doctor or join any other profession because to do so would be to compromise your faith too much? And do you think we're going into that kind of situation?
Yes, yes, of course. And I described one in England, and you've described one in Slovakia. Mine was a few hundred years back, and so on. But these underground bishops and priests didn't seek to save the culture. They sought to save those people whom they could talk to in their immediate environment, and hoped to spread the message to those people to whom the message could be spread. And beyond that, they couldn't see, and they didn't need to see, and they didn't need to have a big plan and a big project beyond doing as much as they could to affect those people nearest them and those people beyond them who could be influenced by those nearest them. So I don't believe for a moment in mysterious forces. The reason why the whole culture has changed in ways in which it has changed, the ways it changed in England in the 1530s, or the way it changed in Eastern Europe and Russia in the early part of the 20th century, and then the changes that have occurred throughout the Western world in the last 30 or 40 years. The reason why these have happened is not mysterious. It's that taking one person with another, parish priests and bishops and parents failed to transmit the faith to their children, their parishioners, their diocese. End of story. Then the consequence, the big picture, is the adding up of all those failures. So the only way to succeed is to go back to the beginning and do what you can where you can. Now, if you have the opportunity to publish and to lecture in big audiences and so on, of course you should fulfill that responsibility. But if you don't, then you still have very serious, perhaps more serious responsibilities to those in your immediate neighborhood. So thinking small, I think, is more important than thinking big.
Well, is it the case that Dariusz and the folks in Poland are able to think big because they thought small for so long and they preserved the faith much better there than we have farther west? Do you think that could be true, Dariusz?
No, definitely. I mean, our case. Well, start with your example about small responsibility, which I generally agree. But of course, it can't explain the reason why St. Paul was strolling around Mediterranean world. It was not based on the repeating old story to the newborn children. I mean, it was.
What's spread? Islam? Or
no. St. Paul. St. Paul. Yes. So that's not the only one way how. Christian, that's the first thing. The second is that we definitely, I mean, you have my agreement on the importance of a small picture, but from the other side, we are, even if we are political or religious minority, we cannot agree on the status of a cognitive minority. We have a universal message. And I don't see possibility. Maybe that's very strongly underlined by my Polish experience. But for me, the question, how may look like the economical system if we embody the Christian values in that, it's a practical answer. I mean, we discussed it in Poland. I mean, it was my huge, brutal sometimes discussion with a neoliberalism in the beginning of a Polish independence was focused on the question that I was insisting that in certain level of consumism, which is probably important for a dynamicity of a market, should be limited because of some more important value, even if free market will be not as effective as it could be when it is, and it's not a theoretical problem. I mean, it was nothing that I could say, okay, it's enough that I will read St. Thomas and St. Augustine with my three sons, what we like to do. But I mean, we had to answer serious question. I mean, and I never have a comfort that my student comes and say, okay, tell me only about St. Tertullian, Augustinus, and American conservative. But they ask me what to do in politics, what to do in culture. I mean, how to react on certain things. I mean, big picture is necessary, even if we are not, let's say, selfish enough to believe that we can create it.
So before you answer, let me just move to the first perspective from the point of view of the religion and church. So, I mean, you sketch for us the distinction between transmission of faith and an attempt to either change the culture or fight the culture, counterculture or something. So could we join this from the point of view of, well, what is the perspective from the point of view of religion? Is there a crisis in the church, and therefore we have this difficulty of the Christianity in the post-Christian society? Or what kind of a thing is going on in the church, and has that to do with what we're talking about?
Well, yes, I've said twice, you know, that the church has been penetrated by secularist ideas, and it's been penetrated up to the top levels, and that's a very serious problem. And when I talk about communicating the faith to your children or to your students or to the immediate environment, I'm talking about the faith, and the faith is universal because it's a set of truth claims, and some of those truth claims are certainly about the entitlement to have property and to not regard the rich as simply evil, and there are a set of reasons why private property can, under certain conditions, etc., be not only just, but the most appropriate system which everyone should support. So if one has the opportunity as a citizen, and one has not ceased to be a citizen, even though one may be prevented from joining a particular profession, and as a citizen, one is invited to subscribe to some false theory of the state or of the economy or of the church, then one must respond. And I don't in the least exclude talking about big things. When I say, what I am saying is, you don't need to have a plan about the big future that you could somehow manage from starting from here to get to there. You communicate with those to whom you can communicate by virtue of the opportunities you have. And that doesn't mean being passive. You can look for opportunities. But I don't think one needs a 5-year plan or a 10-year plan for the society as a whole. You may need a 5-year plan and a 10-year plan for the friends whom you can influence, or the specialized friends who are economists or constitutional theorists, or who can organize in the defense of some segment of the nursing or medical profession that can somehow recreate itself against the tyrannous imposition of immoral procedures and so forth. I'm not recommending passivity or a kind of defeatism, but we have to acknowledge that our problem is largely the failure at an earlier stage to communicate the truth claims of the faith itself before we get to relatively sophisticated political, theoretical questions, economic questions, and so on. The truth claims about divine revelation and the completion of the revelation in events that really happened in Palestine in around 30, and the church that really was formed, and where it's to be found, and it's not everywhere, but it's somewhere, and what message did it really communicate? And we've got numerous competing messages, leaving aside all the other religions which have come into view across the horizon. Can we understand ours as true, and why is it true? And I think those are the prior questions, and those are the questions which our bishops, our priests, and our parents and ourselves have failed adequately to grapple with.
Well, it's not only the catechesis, a failed catechesis, which is certainly true, but it's a failure of spiritual formation, of forming the heart through practices. This is something that I didn't discover until later in my life, because I had a very highly intellectual idea what the faith is. And it's not a matter of saying either or, but I have noticed in my own life and in the lives of my children that the practices have been at least as important, and perhaps even more important than the intellection. Than the intellectual part. And I see so many parents, people I meet in my travels and my work in the U.S., complaining about their children don't know what's going on, and they're doing their very best, but blah, blah, blah. And yet, they never question about whether or not it was wrong to give their children a smartphone. You know, you see all these little children sitting around on their smartphone, and it's not so much what they're seeing on their smartphone as the fact that this little phone, the technology, is fragmenting their attention, and it's reformatting them, it's training them in a sort of liturgy of technology that makes it even harder to even approach the truth claims of Christianity. So this is the crisis of the church. It is, yes, as Professor Finn has said, a crisis of catechesis from the top, from the institutional church, down to the local church, down to the family, but it's also a failure of habits and disciplines, a failure to order our lives around the service of God. This is why I find St. Benedict so compelling. We're not called to live in a monastery, but we are called to live in ways in our lives in the world that are ordered more properly to the worship of Jesus Christ.
I have nothing to add. I mean, I understand you.
I think the failure goes much deeper than catechesis, and I talked about this last night extensively. So there's a failure of what is wrongly called fundamental theology, wrongly because fundamental theology now occupies the field that was occupied in a more rational and faithful theological education of the clergy. And it was an instruction, philosophical, historical instruction in the foundations of the faith, the existence of God, the historical existence of revelation, and the identification of the content of that revelation prior to theology, which assumes the revelation and then considers the meaning of the principles. The absorption of all that into so-called fundamental theology has meant that the education of the clergy, and that means ultimately of the bishops and ultimately of the highest bishops, has been radically distorted for 60 years, and we are living with the consequences. This is by far not the only cause of the crumbling of Christianity, but it's a major obstacle to even beginning to confront the situation after the crumbling.
So who should confront the situation? I mean, just from the point of view of a Christian sitting in the audience, like, what should we do? I mean, it sounds like an elite is missing. Someone well-educated who understands, go really deep into the questions. I mean, do we lack those? Is it the crisis of elite? Of certain kind? And if yes, what do the not elite could do in the meantime?
Well, it is a crisis of the elite. I'm calling it a crisis of the clergy, right, because it's their task to communicate the faith by catechesis and through practice and through a set of liturgical and other practices of prayer, etc., which do communicate the faith, and not some happy story or some set of good feelings or some dubious claims about you will have an experience of Jesus or such like. They have to communicate a set of truth claims in a culture which is frivolous in many ways and distracted in many ways, but also is rightly focused on the triumph of science and on the triumph of the technology that objective science makes possible. So on the one side, the culture, as I say, is frivolous, but on the other side, it's a culture of truth. And unless Christianity presents itself as part of the truth, and indeed the most important part of the truth, it will simply fail and be brushed aside as a game, as a private hobby, as an experience for some people who, for some reasons that are not clear, have the experience or claim to have the experience, but which is not communicable as true. So the parents have to complain to the bishops that their priests are not telling them the truth and not explaining why it's true. And the bishops at the moment don't care about that, don't listen, and the failing of their congregations and the falling away of their priests into corruption and worse will perhaps, in a new generation of bishops, persuade them to attend to the foundations.
I'm thinking of a play on words. So you're suggesting we're not living in a post-Christian world, but in the world with post-Christians?
I don't know.
Not sure it makes sense. I mean,
that doesn't make anything clear to me.
Darius, you wanted to add something? I saw you not in.
I have a problem to understand what's the difference between my attitude and yours, I'm confused because I feel deeply that each of way I try to conceptualize it, that difference is false. It's not that you are fatalist. That's not true. It's not that you are defensive. It's not totally true. But there is a kind of, say, feeling of those two elements. That's what I felt reading excellent book of Ron, is that you are not fatalist, but a fatalistic perspective serves you to reach your concept of Benedictine option. Somehow, I mean, that it's better for Benedictine option, believing that it's very bad. I don't know United States, of course, on the level which may help me to judge, is it as bad as you says, but I know hundreds of Polish intellectuals who through last 30 years tried to convince me that after tomorrow church will be not existing, and that we have even was discovered a concept of negative secularization, which was, I mean, secularization is a necessary law of sociological changes, and now through certain time we have a back move, which help not to falsificate the concept of secularization as a general terror. It's an absurd. I think that first of all, that's my strong experience taken from my 55 years old life, is that I faced 10 changes which had nothing in common with any rational vision of that what may happen. I mean, communism was very strong, Russia was very strong. That's the first thing. The second thing is that I remember changes, deep changes in society, for example, towards opinion on abortion. We left communist time with almost 100% acceptance, a kind of acceptance. It doesn't mean that every Christian accepts the abortion as an act, but culturally, people call it zabieg, what means, how to explain zabieg? That's intervention, intervention. I mean, just one of a word which can help to make it something unimportant. After 30 years, I think, I'm not wrong, majority of Poles are anti-abortion. We have anti-abortion law, and majority of young people are against abortion. Majority of young people. I mean, where the secularization law is. I mean, who can convince me that we can't influence reality? That we don't need a big picture, that it's impossible. So I'm afraid that we agree on certain assumptions on the character of a presence of Christianity in the world, which is a kind of I mean that we plan something and it happens.
Self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yes, self-fulfilling prophecy, thank you. My English is horrible. And one of them, it's an assumption that public square should be neutral, one of them. I mean, which a lot of Christians in the West accept. One of an example is Rocco Buttiglione, I mean, who is a victim of his own concept in the public square. I mean, he assumed something what killed him as a Christian politician in the end. So we have a certain prejudices on the big square which are anti-Christian. You said that clergy and a big part of a church share anti-Christian opinion. But I think that one of the biggest problems is that those opinions are connected with character of the heart of a Christian life, the character of our witnessing of Christ, that we start believe that there is something wrong with witnessing Christ in many places. I mean, we've been pressed by a neutral and liberal culture to find it as something which might be offensive. I mean, the last stage, it's your extremely sad story in last days in Oxford with students who, in fact, try to persecute you as a Christian. I mean, that's a proper name of that, what happened with Professor Finnis. And please make him a big applause. I know Oxford quite well. I've been several times on the scholarship, and I can imagine what that action means and how it's violating, say, idea of university itself, not even Christianity. So please receive my act of solidarity. But I'm afraid that somehow we start the process which now we can't really judge a reason, and I think that we in the Central Europe, we are before the decision that we can disagree on the rules who finally lead to the persecution of church. Smooth persecution, symbolical, finally who knows which kind, but definitely with agreement of Christian start a mechanism who ended with a persecution of that kind which you faced in Oxford.
I want to jump in and say that I completely agree with you, Professor Finnis, about the failures of the institutional church to teach and to form. But I'm reminded of a conversation I had about 20 years ago when I was living in Brooklyn, New York. I was a Catholic in those days, and one of my favorite pastimes was to sit around with my Catholic friends, all of us conservatives, and complain about how terrible the bishops were and how terrible everything was in the church. Finally, one of my friends who did that was himself a Catholic priest of my generation, and he said to us guys sitting around talking about so badly about the church, he said, guys, everything you say is true, but my parents here in New York raised me in the 70s when catechesis collapsed. Everything fell apart in the church. My parents knew that they could not trust the bishops and the institution to teach and form us children, so they took the responsibility themselves. He said, they did that in the 70s when this was difficult. Today, said my priest friend, you have so much available to you. John Paul has given us the catechism. That's a wonderful gift. You have the internet where you can go on Amazon.com and have a library sent to you in a few days that Aquinas could only have dreamed of. You have a way to get in touch with each other on the internet, to find other Catholics who agree with you and who share the sense of mission you have for your families. You can homeschool your kids, and so on and so on. So he said, why don't you do it? Stop sitting around waiting for the bishops to get their act together. It's not going to happen in your lifetime. Christ wants you right now, and there are things you can do if you take responsibility as Christians for yourself. It was an amazing speech. And we looked at each other, my friends and I, and then we started complaining about the bishops again. But I've been haunted by that priest's teaching because he was right. And I've seen this happen. It's happening right now in the United States, where things are in much worse condition than in Poland. And I wrote the Benedict option as an American for Americans. It was a blessing that it's been translated into 10 languages. But we're seeing now with the homeschooling movement in the US and with various experiments done by Catholics and other Christians with classical education, all kinds of amazing initiatives that are being taken by the faithful laity who are not sitting around and waiting to be told what to do, but claiming their faith that was handed down by the apostles for themselves.
Well, of course, I agree, because I started by saying that it's parents' responsibility to hand on their faith first, and that doesn't wait on the bishops to get their act together at the level of fundamental theology. But it's extremely difficult for parents if they can't identify which website and which books and so forth are genuine Christian or Catholic books, and they're on their own much of the time. So the two problems go together. It's not just one rather than the other. But you can look, I'm not a conservative, but I do look at conservative websites from time to time. I look at traditional websites. I've never seen a discussion of the questions which I raised last night and I've raised again this evening. The problem is not being identified either by the bishops or by most of the clergy or by most parents, and that's why I'm talking about it. And this is a big picture. You can't get a bigger picture than the one I'm talking about. But it isn't about a plan for the future of the whole culture. It's about how to communicate the truth to the people to whom you can communicate it, and first of all, the people to whom you have a responsibility to communicate it to. So we have to start, I'm afraid we have to start afresh. I mean, the problem that confronts the church now is in some ways, much more serious than the problem that confronted the shattered church after the French Revolution. I mean, the church that was shattered in France and throughout most of Europe, as it had been shattered in England a couple of centuries before, though in a different way. Now our problem is similar in some respects, the degree of shattering of the whole, but it's worse because we don't have sound, by and large, there are exceptions, a sound tradition within the church of handing on its fundamental truths to its own ministers. So that's a bleak message for those of us who are not in charge of seminaries or of choosing the clergy or choosing the bishops or choosing the Pope. But that's where a major problem lies, and unless people start talking about it, we can't start doing anything. So I've spent the last 7 or 8 years working on these fundamental problems, not because I should, by virtue of my training, but because I have the opportunity and I can see the problem, and not very many people are seeing it. I'm not at all alone. I've found good models, philosophical models, historical investigations into the foundations of the faith, etc., that I can helpfully pursue. But that's where the problem is. I shouldn't be having to do it. It should be being done in all those great theological institutions. It should be being done in the great Catholic universities that did exist only 30 or 40 years ago and now virtually have ceased to exist. There was a kind of complacency and negligence built into the pre-Vatican II church, symbolized in a small way by the complete failure. This is now a humble scene, not the big scene I've been talking about, but the failure of the gigantic historical resources, scholarship in history, available to American Catholic universities to investigate the questions about the history of abortion and abortion law so as to be prepared for the cases that eventually came in 1970 and 71, which found them wholly unprepared, so that a completely fictitious history could be used as the basis for the Supreme Court's disastrous decision. Now, there were hundreds and hundreds of Catholic professors of history. Not one of them had investigated anything. In a few hours of investigation, I discovered more than had been discovered by thousands of paid historians in great Catholic universities who ought to have done this decades before. So this is a symbol of the failure of diagnosis and complacency that was part of the causes which we need to investigate before we can think of solutions.
So we usually think of the crisis of identity, sexual abuse, different type of crisis, but the crisis of diagnosis, it's a new one and quite fitting. So before starting taking questions from the audience, I'd like to wrap up this first part just briefly having your thoughts on liberalism. People in Slovakia keep discussing liberalism. We have mentioned secularism. Some people identify liberalism immediately with secularism. Chesterton himself, in his paradoxical way, said that he was both liberal and conservative, since simplistically for him, liberalism brought democracy and conservatism conserved the tradition, and he couldn't have that either way, but both. So what's your thoughts about liberalism and post-Christian world? Is liberalism the thing?
Well, I spent 30 or 40 years debating about liberalism with two great liberals, Ronald Dworkin and Joseph Brows, who each cast their legal theory and their political theory as liberal theories. And each year we would meet in a joint seminar, and I would solemnly read a paper saying nobody should frame their legal or political theory as liberal, or indeed as anti-liberal. The term is too vague to be of any use. And so forth. I didn't make much impression on them, though perhaps, I don't know, perhaps a little. But that's, I think, an important truth. I was the beneficiary of the good liberalism of my strongly anti-religious supervisor who in effect appointed me to a lifetime appointment in Oxford because he was an honest liberal. He hated my views, but he thought I was competent and I fitted the position, so he, in effect, appointed me, as it were, for life. H.L.A. Hart. He disguised from me how much he hated religion. He knew my views. So this was, I have been for 40 years, 50 years, the beneficiary of good liberalism. And the threat to that liberalism that is presented by a new liberalism, or I don't know what, the label doesn't matter, is very real, and you just described a certain kind of threat to it. It's still strong in Oxford, it's under threat. In many places it's no longer very strong. So that's one good thing about liberalism, an ideal of free speech and free inquiry, etc., which is a good aspect of the Enlightenment, which contains much falsehood and error with bad consequences. However, I think in the end there's no one answer. Should we be liberals or not liberals? Well, in this respect we should be liberals, in that respect we should not, etc. Thank you.
Reactions? Comments?
With being conscious is that speaking in that, let's say, genre on what liberalism is after thousands of books on that, I would risk. The problem with classical liberalism is that it was invented by gentlemen who take for granted that the axiological structure of society is firm and nothing should help it to, let's say, reproduce, because it's self-reproduction structure. I mean, that's not true. The problem is that when liberalism, with its concept of a, let's say, minimal state, and with a concern of treating political reality as restricted to some process, economical life, and some instruments of being in power, they forgot that axiological fundament which help liberalism exist is consumed by that mechanism, is consumed. And we are living in the moment when it's done. I mean, nothing left, nothing left. One of a picture from famous Oxford I have. It's tribes of a completely drunk young people lying on the street. I mean, that's a barbarian, I mean, in a clear sense. That's the end of liberalism. That's a real end of liberalism. I mean, we came to the point in which we doesn't need barbarian which could come to Carthage. We have, I mean, we educate our own tribe of barbarians because the story is finished. I mean, the thought of a classical liberals, I mean, fail, and we see it. I mean, it's falsificated. I mean, that's one of an example how social and political theory was falsificated in the proper Popperian meaning. What to do with that from the Catholic point of view? Of course, it's somehow enemy because it consumes also our let's say production. Because when Professor Finney says that we should work with our kids, that's no doubt it's true, but they at the same time destroy our job and use it. That's, I mean,
they destroy our what?
They destroy our effort. However, they use it. I mean, they are happy that our kids will be paying taxes, but they do everything to demoralize them in any sense of...
Who, they, the media, or what, who?
Let's say general liberal structure of society. I think that's how it exists.
So a law that permits pornography...
That's one of a case, I mean, very important.
A law that permits commercial advertising and... I don't know what the structure is that's having these effects. It's certain. I mean, there's a set of disastrous effects which has a complex causality, and I entirely agree, of course, that all attempts to shortcut the establishment of the moral foundations of the substantive goods which define a successful or an unsuccessful life, a flourishing life, a life of eudaimonia, beatitudo, whatever. That liberal theories are in some respect defined as theories that refuse to confront those issues and that start at a higher level, assuming, as you said, the stable foundation of an established legal order, etc. So I've spent a lifetime in critiquing that and trying to re-establish the substantive foundations and reject the absurd notion of a neutral public square, etc. And all that's necessary. But I don't think it's demonstrated by the drunken undergraduates in Oxford. Hart, whom I mentioned as my teacher and my supervisor, he told wonderful stories of when he was at New College, the great central college in Oxford, in the 1920s, before the culture had disintegrated to the extent that it has. And his descriptions of Saturday night in New College defeat your descriptions. He describes the chaplain of the college being crucified on the lawn by drunken undergraduates with croquet hoops over his arms and legs, and smashed pianos in the front quad, and drunken Australians walking around the first floor, the beading around the college, firing a revolver into each room as he went, etc. This is the 1920s, not the 1990s and so on. So some phenomena are of stronger probative value than others,
Well,
there's a problem.
I'll be very quick. I agree with Professor Patrick Deneen that liberalism has failed because it has succeeded so well. If the ultimate end goal of liberalism is to liberate the choosing self and make the self completely self-defined and self-directed, then liberalism has succeeded at that. But we can't sustain liberalism without a deeper, stronger metaphysic. And I find myself being very doubtful about the liberal tradition, but at the same time realizing that the only hope politically and legally in the United States for people like me, Christians like me, is in a strongly traditional liberal interpretation of the First Amendment, which protects religious liberty and free speech, because the most illiberal people are on the left today. But I would not want to live in a country where the progressives forbid or punish people forbid free exercise of religion or punish people for their speech. And frankly, I don't want to live in a country where the right does the same thing. So I find myself living in bad faith because I'm not a liberal, but because I want my children to be able to practice their faith without being persecuted, boy, do I hope liberalism holds.
Reactions? All right, so let's take the first question from Slido. Actually, the first 3 questions from Slido, and then I come and ask the audience. So the first question on Slido is, should Christianity be adapted to the present modern age and reflect more on it to answer the needs of today?
No.
No.
Yes.
Yes, why?
Because it has to tell the truth, which has been established by modern science, or has to tell the truth in the context established by modern science. And I tried to tell that truth last night, and that's part of confronting the modern age. And if you don't tell a truth that is persuasive, or could even in principle be persuasive to someone who knows a lot of truths that only the modern age discovered, you're out of business.
Well, I'll back up what I've said. I didn't want to be flippant. Well, yes, I did want to be flippant, but I think that Christianity has to adapt itself to the modern world insofar as it must recognize with clear eyes the situation that we're all in and that the church faces in a time where all moral or structure and moral authority has, for most people in liberalism, broken down. The church has to find a way to present the timeless truth in a way that can be heard by the modern audience. But when I usually hear this question, should the church adapt to the modern world, what I often think the questioner means is, should the church start having gay marriages? Should the church ordain women priests? And so on and so forth. If that's what the questioner means, absolutely not. We have to stick with what we know to be true. But if the questioner means, should the church be more aware in a real concrete way of the conditions of modern life and the things that make the Christian message less credible to modern ears, then absolutely yes.
I would say that the problem is that revelation and the Christ is, let's call it quickly, universal and always true. I mean, there's no doubt. But there is nothing like eternal Christianity. Christianity is always particular. I mean, it's always a shape of a culture and society after an effort made by generation who collaborate in incarnation. That, how can I call it? So if the question refer to that work of a generation in incarnating, in collaboration of incarnating the word, logos, in a particular culture, of course, that's our duty. There's no doubt. That's what we have to do. My feeling, because that's surprising, because among us three, I have a kind of a feeling that I was not complaining enough. You gentlemen complain, let's say, on the proper level, but I
never too
didn't. What's quite strange, because Poles love complaining, and I'm a very typical Pole, so that's surprising attitude. But if I could complain on that, what is, from my point of view, one of the biggest failure of nowadays attitude of Christians toward reality is that we give up the job, that particular job, work in incarnation. I mean, that we are not doing enough to make our translation of Testament of God. I mean, that we have a Jesus did it. I mean, he adapted reality to express the eternal truth. He adapted. I mean, I'm a philosopher of politics and religion, but I do a lot with early Christianity and the late Judaism. And I mean, you see the job in Alexandria, you see it in Ephesus, in Antiochia, in everywhere. You see the job of incarnation. I mean, the early church is all the time working on that, in the language, in the culture, in the image, everywhere. I mean, they are not leaving any occasion to find a way of a proper, precise expression of the word in a nowadays language, in a nowadays category. Finding a proper picture, how to take Orpheus and put a Christ in Orpheus, how to take mythological stories and find an element who may talk to the contemporary people on that, what's Revelation about. We give up it. I mean, we give it up. I mean, that's very interesting. We agree, for example, on Protestantic iconoclasm in the culture. We do agree. I talked today with friends from the Janus Society, and one of lady who is artist, and say, see, almost everyone saw a serial movie, New Pope, Young Pope. There's a series of pictures on the beginning of that film, and you see portraits of a most famous Pope, painted by a most famous artist of age. You have Raphael, you have Velasquez, many of them. And on the end, you see a construction of one of a leftist artists. It's a John Paul II under a meteor. And I realize that the only Christian art we have in our century is anti-Christian art. The only art of our time is anti-Christian art. What's the reason? One of them is that we do not order art. We do not order art. Even John Paul II, who is absolutely conscious of a role of art and culture in the Christianity, would be completely surprised if someone would tell him that he should order his portrait in, I don't know, asking Bacon or whoever to do it. I mean, we agree on that. I mean, that's of course a big picture. That's a top. That's a clergy decision. But we agree on that on the very small elements. I mean, why the language of a Catholic university is a sociology, not St. Thomas? I mean, that's a big question. I mean, why do we agree on not looking for a new language for St. Thomas? I mean, you are a big example that it is possible. You are not a neo-Thomist. I have a lot of friends in Poland who are doing the same. I mean, we are studying St. Thomas and looking at language. But in general, we agree that it's not our task. And I think to fulfill the need of complaining. That's it.
So there is a related question. So keeping the panelists to keep the answers short as well. But I mean, you can go, but keep it please short.
I'll keep it short. When I was starting to write the Benedict option, Professor Michael Hanby at the John Paul II Institute in Washington, I asked him for his advice. He said, I want you to think about what Karol Wojtyła did when the Nazis occupied Poland. I said, what do you mean? He said, think about what he did. He started a theater company, and he and his circle there started a theater company because they knew that the Nazis intended to completely extinguish the Polish people and their national memory. And they knew that the most important thing to do in that crisis was to keep the memory of what it meant to be Polish alive. And that also meant what it meant to be a Catholic. Hanby said that that is the task in front of us today, to look to art and beauty to convey the radical strangeness of Christianity and to keep it alive in this time of collapse. So I think Wojtyła, the actor, and his circle there have a big lesson to teach us.
It doesn't look like LGBT ideology is influencing culture by thinking small. They are very loud, one could say. They implement, well, fake it until make it approach. Or do you think it just happened naturally as a result of failing to pass on Christian faith?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question. I think the answer to both is yes. The gay marriage issue was lost in the United States long before the Obergefell decision of the Supreme Court to make it constitutional. It was lost in the 60s and 70s when heterosexuals changed the idea of what marriage is to make it expressive of desire and not to be anchored in something transcendent and the traditional moral order. So the ground was being prepared for gay marriage long before gay activists actually started to ask for it. And when they did start to ask for it in the mid-1990s, the media, and I was a member of the media was absolutely 100% on their side. I can remember having arguments in the newsroom of a major newspaper where I worked around 2006, where journalists said forthrightly, there are no two sides here. There's only one side, and it's justice, and it's pro-marriage. And so, yeah, there was this, they captured the elites, both in the media, in the law, and in corporations, and in academia, and then it was a fait accompli. But again, this happened decades before.
Wants to add anything?
Yes, and I agree with the animus of the question that it wasn't a matter of thinking small, but it was thinking concretely about the opportunities of influencing elites in a given set of specific cultural situations. But certainly the underlying cause of it was the collapse of the Church's defense of sexual morality in the 1960s. And so 2 weeks after Pope Paul's Humanae Vitae encyclical, the then Archbishop of Washington issued a pamphlet to the people of his archdiocese, which was written by my friend and mentor and colleague Germaine Grisey, in which the final, it's a set of questions and answers, and on the final page, I've forgotten the question and the form of the answer, but the Archbishop speaking, as it were, as the voice of Grisey and vice versa, says, if you accept contraception, you will accept homosexual marriage. And at the time, nobody thought of that. But there's the Archbishop of Washington telling the truth, which was the truth that he made the basis of his attempt to oblige his clergy to shape up or ship out. They must preach the encyclical or give up their pastoral duties. The Holy See did not support him in that, The priests appealed to the Holy See, and after some interval of time, the Holy See rejected his position and required him to take them back. And after that, the Holy See, on the whole, failed to insist upon the doctrine. And so gradually the doctrine, in fact quite soon, the doctrine was stifled. The bishops of England from the outset prohibited their clergy to preach about contraception at all. So I've never heard a sermon about contraception, not once in 50 years. Of course, people then say the church is obsessed with sex, but the church never discusses sex. It's almost impossible to find the church's teaching about it. It's hidden away in the catechism in inconspicuous places. So the simple teaching that all sex is for marriage and that outside marriage sex is, that's stated, you can find it, there's one sentence in the catechism, it's almost hidden. It's not made the center, the beginning and the end and the middle of the chapter. So the catechism is partly a failure through its gross over-complexity, its decoration with pictures and so forth, instead of a simple set of intelligible messages which are true. So there's the deep source of the problem, the abdication of Christianity from its gospel message.
Shortly, please.
My problem is that 2 hours ago in that room I tried to explain, and it take me 1 hour, and I don't think that I fulfilled the topic. But my feeling is that the problem with LGBT has nothing in common with sex itself, and it even has nothing in common with homosexual or any other people who are practicing something which is not compatible with the Catholic teaching. So it has nothing in common with those two things we usually think it is. It is about political power. It is about political power. The, say, structure of a power in nowadays society is based on a positive rule of law. Positive rule of law. And the power of people who are in charge of having power is based on creating and executing law. LGBT, as well as many others concepts generally called gender, are directed to the goal to destroy autonomous source of axiology, which is family, national states, and the church. And it has nothing to do with sex, pleasure, and hedonistic things. It's only about power. And even those, my feeling is, even those homosexuals who think it's about sex and sexual identity are absolutely false. They are only an instrument of destroying the autonomous source of power and identity. That is about it. That's why all that discussion on the church who has obsession, etc. No, the reason why the problem is stated is that it helped to find a support, social support, to destroy the authority of church. That's the only thing.
Yes, but they, as Rodrea says, they only get the support from the willing. The homosexuals themselves are of course a tiny minority, 2-3%, etc. But so they depend on, for their power, whether the power is through law, through discrimination law, simply through the adoption of a policy in a law firm or in a university, etc. It doesn't really matter whether the law comes in. They get their power from the heterosexual majority, who can't see a principle on which to stand against the claims to sexual liberty that the homosexuals make.
Well, and they, because the heterosexuals don't accept it themselves. I think this is
what I'm saying. We're entirely
I think
in agreement.
We agree. Yeah, I think it's a matter of in what is man, what is human nature. I think transgenderism has gone so quickly and been accepted so quickly because it already resonates with what people under late liberalism believe about human autonomy and human self-definition. So something as outrageous as the idea that you can change your sex, it actually makes sense to a people who have ceased to believe that there is any transcendent meaning or that there is any rationality, any logos within the material world that we can know. And so if it's all about nominalism, if it's all about being able to look at matter and call it whatever we want that suits our desires, then of course this is going to happen. We should expect it.
Yes, I agree, but up to the point that I don't think grand theoretical ideas about nominalism or search for autonomy or self-definition are really the source of the problem. They are a kind of epiphenomenon or superstructure that intellectuals erect to create some sort of chatter that makes the plausible story and tell themselves and amuse themselves with this story, but what's operating on the ground is a failure to understand something much more concrete, namely the conditions of true marriage, of a real marriage. These are established by the constitution of human nature, but we don't need a grand theory of nature. The theory of nature comes, as it were, at the end, and what we need is a concrete understanding of the kind of commitment that is needed of two people, male and female, to justify their generating, procreating children for whom they take responsibility through, in effect, a lifetime. And a comprehensive responsibility, and the comprehensiveness of the commitment, and then the ability of a certain kind of action, marital action, at the heart of a whole common life between the spouses. The intelligibility of that kind of action, and only that kind of action, in expressing and actualizing and making real to themselves their commitment. So this action really expresses the commitment, and the two go together, and the failure to understand that interconnection, which is not a grand theory, it's a specific truth, is what the essence of the failure of the church. I said to hand on the gospel, but it's really to hand on the natural law too. This is all well understood by Plato, and to some extent by Aristotle. Long before Christianity. So Plato's critique of homosexuality and his defense of marriage in the laws, it can be improved and pulled together as a critique, but it's got the truth. And the gospel truth is a ratification of it, a re-proclamation of it, a deepening of it, a connection of it with the whole of creation and of salvation.
I was told we have 15 minutes to go, 15. So I'll just go quickly with this last question I announced, and then we go to the audience. So the ideological center of the Christian world is Christ and the gospel. Is this joyful news no longer joyful and no longer compelling? What came in its place?
Well, I don't think one should worry too much about whether it's joyful or not. It's true, and establishing that it's true, and the truth being what it is, namely that it's an opportunity of eternal life with the Creator, it tends to justify joy in those who judge that it's true, accept that it's true, and accept the will to live according to it, to live according to the will of the Creator in the hope of that eternal life and the knowledge that it's possible. And that's a source of joy. But it's not a search for joy. Joy, if it comes, is a side effect, a bonus. It can't be demanded. It's not what we should preach as what we've got to offer. We should tell people they can welcome it if it comes, but it's likely to come in rather in the form of suffering or something that's short of joy, and just a resolution to live according to the truth.
Question from the audience.
I think sometimes we have problem that we must save the world, but the world was already saved by Christ on the cross. And very important thing yesterday, you said, Mr. Derer, that you lost your faith because you were not prepared in the prayer. And today, Professor Finis said that parents are in a hard situation because they don't have bishops and priests to help them. So I think we are hands of God and to act in the world. And we must prepare for it in the prayer. But sometimes there's also a problem that we think God can say, do things without us. My question is personal. Where is the balance? Where is the balance of acting in our skills and what we have, and preparing for doing and acting in the prayer? What do you three personally do with this?
If I understand your question correctly, I make a point to live an ordinary Christian life, regular confession, going to the liturgy regularly, reading scripture, thinking about the faith, and also trying to work with my hands, not only in prayer, but in serving other people. I do it very badly all the way around, but thanks be to God, He is merciful, and I can go to confession and receive forgiveness and the inspiration, the impetus to go out and try again. I used to believe that I had to save the world. Now I think that I agree with the teaching of Saint Seraphim of Sarov, one of the great modern Russian Orthodox saints. He said, acquire the Holy Spirit and thousands around you will be saved, as a byproduct of just living a faithful life as transparently as you can before God in repentance and in love. This sounds so sentimental and abstract in many ways, but there's nothing more concrete than that. When I see in my own life faithful Christians, Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, who center their life around Jesus Christ, you can see in their face and their deeds that Jesus has made a difference in their life. Jesus is what gives them life. Jesus is their life, and I want to imitate them. That may not be a satisfying answer, it's not a grand answer, but it's the best I can do, because when I tried to go grander, I failed miserably.
I start with a last question. That's a question on what should we or what do we stick to? The question of like or dislike is very similar to the question of being happy or being unhappy. And the classical answer, it's an answer of Clement from Alexandria, who says in the hypothetical style that if for Christian Gnostic, he developed a concept of a judge Christian as a Christian Gnostic, could or be faced with a choice between happiness and true, if it's possible that they are not together, he adds, if it's possible they are not together, he of course will choose true. Your question reminds me of a situation in St. John's College in Oxford, one of my Wittgensteiner friends asking me what I'm working on. after listening my short explanation, says, but Darius, listen, the hypothesis of existing of God is not nowadays very popular. Do you agree? He says. And I says, well, but you agree that it's not a good philosophical argument. And that's exactly the same with happiness, acceptance, widespread opinion. I mean, we are confronted with truth. So the first spontaneous answer on our question was that, as we say in Poland, that's a question to wash hands or food. I mean, we should do all of them together. And of course, it's quite clear that when we don't have an intellectual structure, we risk religious sentimentalism. In a case we forgot about good intellectual formation, when we focus only on intellectual formation without judging whole other aspect of our human integrity, we risk to be called, in fact. But that it was a first reaction. Then I thought that probably the proper answer is less sympathetic for intellectuals, because among saints we have many uneducated people, including idiots, regular idiots. But we never saw intellectuals who has no faith and no judgment of that, let's say, existential kind, So, although I think it should be proportional, and that's an ideal, I think that we have to remember the opinion which I've read first, and and I have to remind it because I own that Australian philosophers a lot. That's Eric Osborne, an excellent specialist on patristic philosophy, very deep thinker, not well known very much, but one of the most interesting person in the Christian world in the 20th century, I think. And he wrote somewhere then true, that also that intellectual true, except some mystics, which are few in generation, comes always to us through people, So that's a very good answer on the question where this existential, where's the limit between that, let's say, existential and judgment and the intellectual one. I mean, that we realize that the source of truth is a testimony, that problem disappear, in fact, somehow. Because sometimes the truth is connected with our intellectual ability and the intellectual potential of that person who comes to us. Sometimes it's unnecessary. That's, I think, the only, say, answer I can give on that question.
Let's be brief, and we can conclude with two questions, one from Slido and the last one from the audience. I think this one is meant for you, Professor Finnis. Recently, Benedict XVI reaffirmed the importance of moral absolutes. Would you agree that, three things, would you agree that without the moral absolutes, no morality, not even Catholic, is possible? Would you agree that the crisis of morality is anthropological crisis based? And would you agree that, or would you agree what common bases are needed for any reasonable moral discussion?
How can that man answer that?
Did I mention a miracle at the beginning?
Just say yes.
Yes, I've written a book about moral absolutes. I believe in them. I don't know what the term anthropological means really in this context, and I'm suspicious of claims that that the moral truth rests on an anthropological truth, although I understand a sense in which that's true. But I believe that one comes to an adequate knowledge of human nature, and in that sense of anthropology, partly through an understanding, a practical understanding of the truths about the goods, of the basic forms of human flourishing. But that's partly a philosophical dispute of the schools, so to speak, and the importance of the moral absolutes in our civilization is very great. They are under threat, and not just under threat, they are being defied by our law and by our culture. I said I'm not a conservative because I've written a book arguing that we should abolish the nuclear deterrence immediately, even though when we wrote it, it appeared that the immediate consequence of abdicating from the French, British, American nuclear deterrent would be Soviet domination. And as you said, it all looked very solid, even in the late in the 1980s. The risk of Soviet power seemed real. It then disappeared like a mist, and you can't understand it unless you lived in those times. So we wrote partly on a false assumption, but the false assumption was not a conservative one. So if we believe in moral absolutes, we have to take them as they are, as they're true. And if they establish, as I believe they do, that having the intention under certain conditions to destroy enemy cities and populations because we have been destroyed, which is the basis of all nuclear deterrence policy, then we have a duty immediately to abrogate that. And that's likely to have many bad consequences and, of course, to be profoundly opposed by almost every political party. It's a radical proposal. The Church at the time, under John Paul II, had the opportunity of judging whether that claim was true and punted, kicked the ball into the grass, refused to answer one way or the other, and gave a kind of conditional blessing to the system of nuclear deterrence, but not for reasons that were expounded or defended, but simply by an act of jurisdiction. So I would like to say just a word about the notion of a balance between prayer and intellectual life
Briefly.
and practical life. The notion of balance is in itself a little misleading because a balance is between two defined weights, and so when the weights are equal, the balance is right. Here there's no defined weights. There is a duty to pray, there is an opportunity to pray, and prayer needs to cover the main bases of adoration and repentance and petition. And it needs to be accompanied by a vivid sense of the truth that our Father in heaven can see us and hear us and will respond, even though we never notice what the response is and may never know it and may never hear any answer of any kind. The truth of the gospel of the revelation, that our prayers are heard, is the foundation of this praxis, and it needs to be a practice, and it needs to be a discipline. And living according to the sacramental rhythm of the Church greatly assists us in that, and, for example, can aid or can hinder the essential priority of adoration. So if the Mass is conducted in a way which reveals the lack of awe and adoration in the priest or the congregation or all of them, then the prayer life of everybody is damaged and endangered.
Thank you. I was told that the last question should be asked in person, so please do find out guests and ask them in person. So now please join me in thanking them.